The early morning light filtered through the dusty blinds of Eleanor Wright's modest home in Columbus, Ohio. At 73, she had spent decades fighting for justice in courtrooms across America. Now, her battleground was limited to her small garden and the occasional pro bono consultation for younger lawyers who sought her counsel. That Wednesday morning seemed like any other. Eleanor sat in her worn leather armchair, surrounded by towering bookshelves filled with law texts and civil rights manuscripts. Her weathered hands, which had once pounded courtroom podiums and drafted landmark cases, now gently held a cup of chamomile tea. The steam rose in lazy spirals, much like her thoughts of cases long past. Her small ranch house on the outskirts of Columbus had been her sanctuary for 40 years. The walls were adorned with black and white photographs documenting moments of triumph in her career. Marches, courthouse steps, celebrations of hard-won victories. But lately, the silence in her home seemed to grow louder with each passing day. Eleanor had been contemplating writing her memoirs. Her granddaughter, Isabella Turner, had been urging her to document her experiences, especially now that civil rights were once again at the forefront of national conversation. But something held her back. Perhaps it was the feeling that her story was incomplete, that there was still more to be done. The morning paper lay unopened on her coffee table, its headlines screaming about modern injustices that felt painfully familiar. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface when the doorbell rang. The sound was so unexpected that she nearly spilled her tea. Eleanor wasn't expecting anyone. Her daughter, Olivia Roberts, usually called before visiting, and her weekly grocery delivery wasn't due until Friday. The doorbell chimed again, more insistent this time. She rose slowly, her joints protesting the sudden movement. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of a sleek black car parked in her driveway, definitely not her usual visitors. Making her way to the door, she straightened her cardigan, a habit from years of courtroom appearances. The woman standing on her porch was not someone Eleanor recognized immediately. She was younger, perhaps in her late 30s or early 40s, with an air of quiet determination that Eleanor found familiar. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a leather portfolio that reminded Eleanor of her own court days. "Mrs. Wright?" the woman asked, her voice warm but slightly hesitant. "I'm Usha Vance. I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I've been hoping to speak with you." Eleanor's mind quickly processed the name. Of course, the wife of the newly elected official, but why would she be standing on her doorstep on a Wednesday morning? "I know this is unexpected," Usha continued, sensing Eleanor's surprise. "But I've read about your work, especially the Carson Heights integration case of '83. I was hoping we could talk." The Carson Heights case. Eleanor hadn't heard that name in years. It had been one of her most challenging victories. A small community that had systematically prevented black families from purchasing homes through manipulative banking practices. The case had taken 3 years and had nearly broken her spirit several times, but the victory had changed hundreds of lives. Eleanor found herself stepping aside, gesturing for Usha to enter. There was something in the younger woman's eyes, a familiar spark that Eleanor had seen in her own reflection decades ago. As they settled in her living room, Eleanor noticed how Usha's gaze moved over the photographs on her walls, lingering on certain images with clear recognition. The younger woman sat on the edge of the sofa, her portfolio clutched close. "Would you like some tea?" Eleanor offered, falling back on decades of Southern hospitality training. "Thank you, but I don't want to take too much of your time," Usha replied. "I'm here because I believe we need your help again." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "My help? I'm retired, Mrs. Vance. My courtroom days are long behind me." Usha leaned forward, opening her portfolio. "This isn't about the courtroom, Mrs. Wright. It's about your experience, your wisdom. We're facing some challenges in our community that..." Echo the ones you fought against. Different decade, same struggles. As Usha began to explain, Eleanor felt a familiar stirring in her chest. The same feeling she'd had when she'd first heard about Carson Heights, when she'd first realized that sometimes justice needed a gentle push from those willing to stand up. The younger woman spoke about current housing disparities, about subtle forms of discrimination that had evolved to avoid legal scrutiny, about families still struggling to find their place in communities that quietly resisted change. Her words painted pictures that felt like echoes of Eleanor's own past battles. "We have lawyers," Usha explained, "young, passionate advocates ready to fight. But they need guidance. They need someone who's walked this path before, who can help them avoid the pitfalls and find the right approach." Eleanor looked at her wall of photographs, at the faces of those who had fought alongside her, many now gone. She thought of the letters she still received occasionally from families who had benefited from her work, of the children and grandchildren who had grown up in homes she had helped their parents secure. "Mrs. Wright," Usha continued, her voice softening, "I know you're retired, I know you've earned your peace, but your experience, your insight, it's invaluable. We're not asking you to return to the courtroom. We're asking you to be a guide, a mentor to a new generation of advocates." The morning light had shifted, casting long shadows across her living room floor. Eleanor could hear the distant sound of children playing in the neighborhood, a sound that always reminded her of why she had chosen this fight in the first place. "Tell me more," Eleanor found herself saying, reaching for her reading glasses. "Tell me about these young lawyers, about the families they're trying to help." Usha's face brightened, and she began pulling documents from her portfolio. As she spoke, Eleanor felt the familiar fire igniting in her chest. The one she thought had dimmed with age. Perhaps her story wasn't as complete as she had thought. Perhaps there were still chapters to be written, not in courtrooms, but in the guidance she could offer to those now taking up the torch. The morning stretched into afternoon as they talked, two women from different generations finding common ground in the eternal struggle for justice. And as Eleanor listened to Usha's passionate descriptions of current challenges, she realized that sometimes the most unexpected visitors could bring the most meaningful opportunities. Their conversation was interrupted by the gentle chime of Usha's phone. "I'm sorry," she said, checking the message. "I have another appointment, but Mrs. Wright, would you be willing to meet with some of our young lawyers to share your experiences, your strategies?" Eleanor looked around her quiet home, at the photographs that had become more like museum pieces than living memories. Perhaps it was time to dust off those memories, to put them to use in a new way. "Yes," she heard herself say, surprising herself, with the firmness of her voice. "Yes, I think I would like that very much." As Eleanor prepared for her first meeting with the young lawyers Usha had mentioned, memories flooded back like a tide she couldn't control. Her home office, once a quiet sanctuary of retirement, now hummed with renewed purpose. She pulled out old case files, yellowed with age but rich with history, spreading them across her desk like a map of battles fought and won. The Carson Heights case files lay open before her, photographs of families who had finally received their keys, their faces beaming with the pride of home ownership. Eleanor remembered every name, every story. The Phillips family, who had saved for 20 years, only to be rejected by 17 different banks. The Anderson children, who finally had a backyard to play in. The Perez couple, who had wanted nothing more than to grow old in a home of their own. Her fingers traced the edges of a particular photograph, a group shot taken on the courthouse steps after the verdict. She was younger then, standing tall despite her exhaustion, surrounded by families whose lives were about to change. The joy in their eyes still moved her, even after all these years. A knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. Through the window, she saw several cars parking along her quiet street. Usha had arrived with the young lawyers she'd spoken about. Eleanor straightened her silk scarf, a habit she'd never quite shed from her courtroom days, and opened the door. Usha stood there with 5 young lawyers, their faces bright with anticipation. "Mrs. Wright," Usha began, "thank you for having us. I hope you don't mind, but word spread about your willingness to meet. And well..." She gestured to the small group behind her. Eleanor welcomed them into her living room, which suddenly felt more like a classroom than a retirement sanctuary. The young lawyers settled in, some on the sofa, others cross-legged on the floor, reminding her of law school study groups from decades past. "Before we begin," Eleanor said, settling into her familiar armchair, "I want to hear your stories. Why are you here? What brought you to this fight?" A young woman named Emma Hall spoke first, her voice steady, but her hands nervously adjusting her glasses. "Mrs. Wright, I grew up in a neighborhood that, well, it wasn't unlike Carson Heights. My parents were the only black family on the block. For 15 years, the things they endured..." She paused, gathering herself. "I became a lawyer because I thought things had changed, but they haven't. They've just become more subtle." Another lawyer, William Green, leaned forward. "We're seeing it in the lending algorithms now. AI systems that somehow always seem to disadvantage certain communities. It's discrimination hiding behind computer code." Eleanor nodded, remembering how discrimination had always found new masks to wear. In her day, it had been neighborhood character and property values. Now it wore the disguise of technology and progress. "Last month," began James Nelson, the youngest of the group, "I had a client, a doctor, perfect credit score, more than enough income, denied a mortgage in Riverside Heights. The reason? The algorithm flagged them as high risk. When I pressed for specifics, I hit a wall of technical jargon and corporate policies." Eleanor rose slowly, walking to her bookshelf. She pulled out a worn leather binder, its pages thick with documents and notes. "In 1983, she began, her voice taking on the tone she'd used in countless courtrooms, "we faced similar walls. They weren't made of computer code, but they were just as impenetrable, or so they seemed." She opened the binder, revealing pages of handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and court documents. The Carson Heights case wasn't won in the courtroom. It was won in the details, in the patterns we uncovered, in the stories we collected. We didn't just prove discrimination existed. We proved it was systematic, intentional, and pervasive. The young lawyers leaned in, their eyes fixed on the documents before them. Eleanor continued, "You're facing a new version of an old problem. The technology may be different, but the impact on families remains the same. The question is, how do we expose it?" Olivia Baker, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. "Mrs. Wright, how did you maintain your focus when the cases seemed impossible, when the system seemed too big to change?" Eleanor smiled, walking to her wall of photographs. She pointed to a particular image, a small house with a "sold" sign. In the front yard, a family standing proudly on their new porch. "This is the Carter family. They were our first victory in Carson Heights. Every time I felt overwhelmed, I looked at this photo. One family, one home, one victory at a time. That's how change happens." The afternoon light filtered through the windows as Eleanor shared more stories, more strategies, more lessons learned through decades of fighting for justice. She told them about the importance of documentation, of building community support, of finding allies in unexpected places. The bank president's secretary, she recalled, was our key witness in Carson Heights. She had been quietly collecting evidence of discrimination for years, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Sometimes your strongest allies are hidden in plain sight. As the group discussed current cases and strategies, Eleanor felt a familiar energy in the room, the same energy that had fueled her own fights for justice. These young lawyers might be facing new challenges, but their passion and determination were familiar friends. The hardest part, Eleanor admitted, settling back into her chair, isn't proving discrimination exists. It's proving it's intentional, systematic and correctable. That's where the real work begins. Usha, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Mrs. Wright, would you be willing to review some of our current cases to help us identify patterns we might be missing? Eleanor looked at the eager faces before her, seeing in them the same fire that had driven her for so many years. Bring me your cases, she said, her voice firm. But more importantly, bring me your stories. Behind every case file is a family, a dream, a future waiting to be realized. The meeting stretched into early evening, with the young lawyers sharing more cases, more challenges, more hopes for change. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. James Nelson was the last to leave, pausing at the door. Mrs. Wright, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Not just for today, but for everything you did before. You paved the way for us. After they had gone, Eleanor sat in her quiet living room, surrounded by the echoes of their conversation. She reached for her phone, dialing a familiar number. Isabella, she said when her granddaughter answered. Remember how you've been asking me to write my memoirs? I think I'm ready now, but not just about the past, about what's happening now, about these young lawyers carrying on the fight. The setting sun cast long shadows across her floor as Eleanor began making notes, her pen moving quickly across the paper. Perhaps this was why Usha had appeared on her doorstep, not just to seek guidance for young lawyers, but to show Eleanor that her story wasn't finished yet. In the growing darkness, Eleanor Wright smiled, feeling more alive than she had in years. Tomorrow, she would begin reviewing cases again, not as a lawyer, but as a mentor, a guide, a keeper of history helping to shape the future. The fight for justice had evolved, but its heart remained the same. One family, one home, one victory at a time. The next few weeks transformed Eleanor's quiet retirement into a hub of activity. Her dining room table, once reserved for solitary meals and occasional family visits, now groaned under the weight of case files, legal briefs, and endless cups of coffee. The young lawyers had taken to calling them rights workshops. These intense strategy sessions that often stretched late into the evening. Today was different, though. Eleanor sat in her garden, enjoying the morning air before what promised to be a particularly important meeting. She'd spent the night reviewing a case that James Nelson had brought to her attention, one that made her blood boil with familiar anger. The Robinson family had been trying to buy a home in the newly developed Oakwood community. On paper, everything looked perfect. Stellar credit scores, stable employment, more than adequate income. Yet every application was met with increasingly creative rejections. The pattern was familiar, but the methods were new, algorithmic redlining, they called it now. The doorbell rang precisely at 9. Eleanor smiled, recognizing Usha's punctuality. But when she opened the door, she found not just Usha and the young lawyers, but also several familiar faces from her past cases. Benjamin Hall, now in his 70s, stood there with his daughter, Emma, the same Emma who had spoken so passionately at their first meeting. Beside them stood Charlotte Turner, whose parents had been among the first families to move into Carson Heights after their victory. These were the living legacy of her work, standing shoulder to shoulder with the next generation of advocates. Hope, you don't mind the surprise guests, Usha said, her eyes twinkling. When they heard about the Robinson case, they insisted on coming. Eleanor welcomed them all into her home, watching as past and present merged in her living room. Benjamin Hall immediately gravitated toward the photograph of the Carson Heights victory, pointing out faces to the younger lawyers gathered around him. "That's my mother right there," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She had saved every Penny for 20 years, working 2 jobs, sometimes 3. When Mrs. Wright won that case, he paused, collecting himself. Well, I got to grow up in a home we owned. My children got to grow up in a better world because of it. Charlotte Turner, now a successful business owner herself, added, and now we're seeing it happen all over again, just in new ways. My son, Alexander Turner, tried to buy in Oakwood last year. Perfect application, but somehow the algorithm found reasons to reject him. Eleanor settled into her familiar chair, watching as the room naturally organized itself into a kind of informal council. The young lawyers sat with notebooks open, while the older generation settled in with the gravity of experience heavy in their postures. The Robinson case, Eleanor began, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation, is not just about one family. It's about exposing a system that's learned to discriminate without leaving fingerprints. James, tell them what you found. James Nelson stood, spreading documents across the coffee table. We've analyzed 3 years of lending data from Oakwood community. On the surface, everything looks perfectly balanced. But when we dig deeper, he pulled out a series of charts, each showing subtle but undeniable patterns of exclusion. The algorithm, Emma Hall added, considers factors like generational wealth and family lending history. On paper, it sounds reasonable, but in practice, Benjamin Hall interrupted, his voice firm, it's punishing families for historic discrimination. My grandparents couldn't get loans because they were black. My parents struggled because my grandparents couldn't. Help them. And now an algorithm is using that history to justify continued discrimination. Eleanor stood, moving to her office. She returned with the Carson Heights files, laying them beside the current data. Look at the patterns, she instructed. In 1983, they used terms like neighborhood character and community stability. Now, they use risk algorithms and lending optimization. Different words, same story. William Green, who had been quietly analyzing the documents, looked up. Mrs. Wright, how did you prove intent in Carson Heights? That's our biggest hurdle now. Proving these algorithms are intentionally discriminatory. Eleanor smiled, a familiar glint in her eye. We followed the money, young man. We always follow the money. She pulled out a yellow document from her files. This memo from a bank executive to his board talked about maintaining neighborhood profiles. Harmless words. Until you looked at their actions. Usha leaned forward, her legal mind clearly engaged. So we need to look at who's programming these algorithms, what data they're choosing to include or exclude. Exactly, Eleanor nodded. Every algorithm has a creator. Every system has architects. Find them, and you'll find your evidence. The discussion continued as the morning turned to afternoon. Eleanor watched as the younger lawyers absorbed not just strategies and tactics, but the living history represented in her living room. Benjamin Hall shared stories of his mother's determination. Charlotte Turner spoke about the impact of home ownership on her family's generation wealth, and through it all, the current challenge of the Robinson family remained at the center of their focus. As the sun began to set, James Nelson stood up, his face set with determination. Mrs. Wright, I think we have a path forward. The Robinson family isn't just fighting for themselves, they're fighting for every family that will face this system. Eleanor nodded, remembering countless similar moments from her own career. Remember, she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. These battles are won in the details, in the late nights poring over documents, in the persistent questioning of every denial. Every computer says no. The group began to disperse, but Charlotte Turner lingered behind. Once they were alone, she turned to Eleanor. You know, Mrs. Wright, when my parents finally got their house in Carson Heights, you told them something I've never forgotten. You said, this key opens more than a door. It opens a future. Eleanor remembered that day clearly. The joy, the tears, the sense of victory tinged with the knowledge that there were still more battles ahead. And now, Charlotte continued, watching these young lawyers, seeing them take up the fight, it's like watching that future unfold. But they need you, Mrs. Wright. They need your wisdom, your experience, your understanding of how these battles are really won. Eleanor walked to her window, looking out at the garden she had tended so carefully in her retirement. The roses were blooming, their persistence a testament to careful nurturing and patience. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I always thought retirement meant stepping away from the fight, but maybe it just means fighting differently. These young lawyers, they have the energy, the technological understanding, the fresh perspective we need. But perhaps what they need most is to know they're not alone, that others have walked this path before them." Charlotte smiled, reaching for her bag. "That's exactly what they need, and that's exactly what you're giving them." She paused at the door. "Same time next week?" Eleanor nodded, already making mental notes about what files to pull, what strategies to review. As she watched Charlotte drive away, she thought about the Robinson family, waiting for their chance at a home. She thought about all the families still facing barriers, about the algorithms and systems designed to say no in new and creative ways. Walking back to her study, Eleanor began writing, her pen moving quickly across the paper. These sessions weren't just about sharing old war stories. They were about building bridges between past and present, about helping a new generation of advocates understand that while the tools of discrimination might evolve, the principles of fighting it remained constant. Tomorrow she would call Isabella about those memoirs again. But now she understood. They weren't just about preserving history. They were about providing a roadmap for the future, about showing that every generation's fight for justice was part of a longer story, a continuous thread of hope and determination woven through time. 3 months after Usha's unexpected visit, Eleanor sat in the courthouse gallery, watching history repeat itself in the best possible way. James Nelson stood before the judge, presenting the Robinson case with a confidence that reminded her of her younger self. The evidence they had gathered lay in neat stacks before him, printouts of code, data analyses, and depositions from former tech employees who had helped design the lending algorithms. But it wasn't just the Robinson family in attendance today. The gallery was filled with faces both familiar and new. Benjamin Hall sat with his daughter Emma, their presence a living testament to the legacy of Carson Heights. Charlotte Turner had brought her son Alexander, whose own rejection from Oakwood had helped them understand the pattern. Usha sat in the front row, her usual composed demeanor tinged with visible anticipation. Eleanor's mind drifted back to the intense weeks of preparation that had led to this moment. Her living room had become a war room, with young lawyers working alongside community members, tech experts, and families affected by the modern face of housing discrimination. They had followed the money, just as she had taught them, but this time through digital pathways and complex computer systems. James was now presenting their key evidence, emails between developers discussing how to optimize the lending algorithms to maintain neighborhood profiles. The language was careful, technical, sterile, but when matched with the lending data they had gathered, the pattern was undeniable. "Your Honor," James said, his voice steady and clear, "what we've uncovered is not just a flaw in an algorithm. It's a deliberate system of digital redlining, using technology to perpetuate the same discrimination that Mrs. Wright fought against in Carson Heights nearly 40 years ago." Eleanor felt a gentle squeeze on her hand and turned to find Isabella, her granddaughter, sitting beside her. Isabella had been documenting everything for the memoir they were now writing together, understanding that this case was both an ending and a beginning. The defense attorney argued about technical complexities and machine learning variables, but Eleanor could see the judge's expression. It was the same look she had seen in Carson Heights, the moment when the facade of technical justification crumbled before the simple truth of injustice. During the recess, Eleanor found herself surrounded by the young lawyers who had become like family over the past months. William Green was still making notes, refining arguments. Olivia Baker was conferring with their tech expert witnesses. The energy in the air was electric with possibility. Mrs. Wright, Noah Phillips, one of their key witnesses from the tech industry, approached her. "I just wanted to say, I helped design systems like this. I never thought about their impact until I saw the faces of the families they affected. Thank you for helping us expose this." Eleanor nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Sometimes the most powerful allies came from within the very systems they were fighting against. The court reconvened, and Eleanor watched as James delivered their closing argument. He held up two documents, her original Carson Heights brief and their current filing. "Your Honor," he began, 40 years separate these two documents. The first helped end explicit housing discrimination in Carson Heights. Today, we're asking you to recognize and stop its digital descendant. The methods have evolved, but the impact on families, on communities, on the fundamental right to fair housing remains the same. When the judge rendered her decision, the gallery held its breath. The ruling was clear. The algorithmic lending practices were discriminatory and had to be completely overhauled. But more importantly, the judge ordered the creation of an oversight committee to review all automated lending systems in the state. Eleanor felt tears in her eyes as she watched the Robinson family embrace. Their victory today would open doors for countless other families, just as Carson Heights had done decades. Later that evening, Eleanor hosted a celebration in her backyard. The same garden that had been her quiet retirement refuge was now filled with 3 generations of fighters for justice. Young lawyers mingled with tech whistleblowers, community activists chatted with former Carson Heights residents, and through it all, Eleanor saw the threads of connection strengthening. Usha found her sitting in her favorite garden chair, observing the gathering. "When I came to your door that morning," Usha said, settling beside her, "I hoped you might offer some guidance to our young lawyers, but you've given us so much more. You've shown us how to connect the past with the present, how to fight old battles with new tools." Eleanor smiled, watching Isabella chat with James Nelson about the next chapter of their memoir. "You know," she replied, "I thought retirement meant my fighting days were over, but sometimes the best way to fight is to help others find their strength." Benjamin Hall raised his glass in a toast. "To Mrs. Wright," he called out, "who taught us that justice doesn't retire." The gathering laughed, but Eleanor could see the serious truth behind his words, reflected in their faces. The young lawyers had learned more than legal strategies in her living room. They had learned about persistence, about the human stories behind every case file, about the importance of connecting past struggles with present challenges. As the evening wound down, Eleanor found herself sitting with the Robinson family. Mrs. Robinson held her young daughter in her lap, the child already half asleep, despite the celebration around them. "My grandmother," Mrs. Robinson said softly, "tried to buy a house in Carson Heights back before your case. She never got the chance. But now, because of what you started and what these young lawyers continued, my daughter will grow up in our own home. She'll have a yard to play in, a community to belong to." Eleanor reached out and squeezed her hand. No words necessary between them. In that moment, she understood why Usha had appeared on her doorstep that morning. It hadn't just been about seeking guidance for young lawyers. It had been about keeping the flame of justice alive, about showing new generations that change was possible, that fights could be won, that justice was worth pursuing despite all obstacles. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the garden was quiet again, Eleanor sat at her desk and opened her laptop, a skill Isabella had insisted she master for their memoir project. She began to type, Justice is not a destination, but a journey passed from one generation to the next. Each victory opens doors not just for today's families, but for tomorrow's dreamers. And sometimes when you think your fighting days are behind, life sends you a surprise visitor who reminds you that the greatest gift you can give is to help others find their own strength to carry on the fight. She looked up at her wall of photographs, thinking about adding a new one. The Robinson family in front of their future home, surrounded by young lawyers who had learned to fight discrimination in its modern forms. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning again. Eleanor Wright smiled and continued typing, knowing that somewhere in Columbus, another family was facing rejection from another algorithm. Tomorrow, she would open her living room again to strategy sessions and planning meetings. The tools might change, the methods might evolve, but the fight for justice remained constant, passed from one generation to the next, one victory at a time.